Before we get into the episode today, I just wanted to talk to those of you who support the show through patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Recently, Patreon announced that they would be changing how they charge fees and shouldering cost onto those who pledge and skimming the increased profit off of the top for themselves. This planned change was met with wide public outcry, and Patreon recently published a retraction just a few days ago stating that they would not be putting the change into place. In the apology announcement, they said that they'll be looking into how to address the issues this change would have fixed in the future, so I'm keeping my eye on their blog post to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. If they threaten to do something like this one more time, it may be time to find a different intermediary between myself and those who wish to support and fund the research that is included in this show. If the announcement of these changes caused you to cancel or change your patronage, I hope that you'll consider jumping back on and continue to support the show. I apologize on behalf of Patreon and to all of you who may have been inconvenienced by this mess, and I hope that it hasn't scared you away if you've been considering supporting the research which goes into the show. We'll thank new patrons or pledge edits once the dust kind of settles from this little kerfuffle. With that out of the way, let's get into today's 20-page essay.
This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason. So if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Today begins part 4 of our walk through the history of polygamy. I'll preface this conversation by saying that I had initially planned to bring a guest onto this week to discuss the history of the fundamental LDS, the FLDS, which will be the focus of today's episode. However, after conducting the interview, I feel like it will be better as a standalone episode. So next week, instead, we're going to have Lindsay Park from Sunstone and Year of Polygamy to discuss some of the nuances of Mormon polygamy, particularly in modern-day practices. As a preface to that interview, today's episode will walk us through 100 years of polygamy history, focusing primarily on the FLDS, the largest and most well-known polygamist faction of Mormonism. It is paramount to understand the content of this episode in order to properly understand the context of what Lindsay and I discuss for next week's episode. With that out of the way, let's talk 20th and 21st century polygamy in Mormonism. We'll spend most of our time discussing the FLDS, but it's important to understand that they are by far not the only polygamous sect out there. We'll be making slight reference to other groups as they kind of crop up in the timeline, but our focus is on the largest population of fundamentalist Mormons, which is the FLDS. To approach this subject, we'll just pick up where last episode left off, with the 1890 Manifesto. That was known as the First Manifesto. Once this first manifesto was published, the practice of polygamy was merely driven further underground in Utah. Utah had been declared a United States territory when the Mormons began flooding in. It was granted territory status in 1848 once the United States won the Mexican War and annexed thousands of square miles. From that point forward, the Utah Territory was in relentless pursuit of gaining statehood, but the public practice of polygamy was the primary holdup. Once the 1890 Manifesto was publicly declared, the United States government essentially put the territory on a bit of a probationary period of 6 years for Utah to get all of its ducks in a row and establish the status quo political parties. Prior to this, most Mormons were members of the Utah People's Party, which the government only marginally recognized as a legitimate political party. In 1894, the government passed the Utah Enabling Act, which gave Utah the ability to compose a state constitution and be admitted into the Union as a state equal with all other states. In 1895, the Utah government officials met in a constitutional convention of sorts and ratified their constitution, and finally, on the 6th of January, 1896, Utah was granted full statehood as the 45th state to gain such status in the Union. But if we just focus on the text alone of the 1890 manifesto, it said nothing about outlawing polygamy or claiming it wasn't a tenet of the Mormon religion. Wilford Woodruff merely advised against anybody taking or solemnizing plural marriage. This was a wink-nod kind of situation for most people practicing plural marriage, and those plural unions were still actively being formed. And one thing worth pointing out here, just like with the abolition of slavery, many families had built their entire structure and livelihood on polygamous practices. Just because something was outlawed didn't mean that it instantly went away. The Utah Constitution explicitly prohibited polygamy with Article 3, stating specifically, quote, "First, perfect toleration of religious sentiment is guaranteed. No inhabitant of this state shall ever be molested in person or property on account of his or her mode of religious worship, but polygamous or plural marriages are forever prohibited." End quote. But that was just the Utah Constitution. That wasn't enshrined in any religious tenet or decree. Utah had been built upon polygamy, and it was a struggle to get people to stop practicing as such, especially those who were already involved in polygamous relationships. A second manifesto was necessary to solidify the LDS religion's stance on new plural marriages being solemnized. This is from the LDS.org essay titled "The Manifesto and the End of Plural Marriage." Quote, "For much of the 19th century, a significant number of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practiced plural marriage, the marriage of one man to more than one woman. The beginning and end of the practice were directed by revelation through God's prophets. The initial command to practice plural marriage came through Joseph Smith, the founding prophet and president of the church. In 1890, President Wilford Woodruff issued the Manifesto, which led to the end of plural marriage in the church. The end of plural marriage required great faith and sometimes complicated, painful, and intensely personal decisions on the part of individual members and church leaders. Like the beginning of plural marriage in the church, the end of the practice was a process rather than a single event. Revelation came line upon line, precept upon precept." Continuing from later in the article, "Church members living in 1890 generally believed that the Manifesto was the work of the Lord, in Franklin D. Richards' words. But the full implications of the Manifesto were not apparent at first. Its scope had to be worked out, and authorities differed on how best to proceed. Quote, "We have been led to our present position by degrees," Apostle Heber J. Grant explained. "Over time and through effort to receive continuing revelation, church members saw by degrees how to interpret the Manifesto going forward. At first, many church leaders believed the Manifesto merely suspended plural marriage for an indefinite time. Having lived, taught, and suffered for plural marriage for so long, it was difficult to imagine a world without it. George Q. Cannon, a counselor in the First Presidency, likened the Manifesto to the Lord's reprieve from the command to build temples in Missouri in the 1830s after the saints were expelled from the state. In a sermon given immediately after the Manifesto was sustained at General Conference, Cannon quoted a passage of Scripture in which the Lord excuses those who diligently seek to carry out a commandment from him, only to be prevented by their enemies. Now quoting George Q. Cannon, quote, "Behold, it behooveth me to require that work no more at the hands of those sons of men, but to accept of their offerings." End quote. Back to the article. Nevertheless, many practical matters had to be settled. The Manifesto was silent on what existing plural families should do. On their own initiative, some couples separated or divorced as a result of the Manifesto. Other husbands stopped cohabiting with all but one of their wives, but continued to provide financial and emotional support to all dependents. In closed-door meetings with local leaders, the First Presidency condemned men who left their wives by using the Manifesto as an excuse. Quote from President Wilford Woodruff, quote, "I did not, could not, and would not promise that you would desert your wives and children," President Woodruff told the men. "This you cannot do in honor." End quote. In 1898, Wilford Woodruff passed away, and Lorenzo Snow took the mantle for a brief period before his death in 1901. With these old holdovers from Nauvoo polygamy gone from the Mormon leadership, Joseph F. Smith, nephew to the original prophet and son of Hiram Smith, took the prophetic mantle and made some powerful reforms to streamline Mormonism and make it more acceptable by the standards of broader Christianity. In 1902, a man named Reed Smoot, an apostle to Joseph F. Smith, ran for Utah State Senate. Smoot was a highly contested public figure as a polygamist running for public office. Smoot won his senatorial seat of Utah in 1903, and the federal government proceeded to hold a series of hearings from 1904 to 1907 known as the Reed-Smoot hearings, bickering about whether or not a polygamist should be allowed to hold a government office. They failed to reach a required 2/3 majority vote to unseat Smoot, and he retained his office as Utah senator. Political action was necessary to show Utah's good faith at the beginning of these hearings, so the prophet Joseph F. Smith issued the 1904 Second Manifesto on Polygamy in the April General Conference, which reads as follows, quote, "Inasmuch as there are numerous reports in circulation that plural marriages have been entered into, contrary to the official declaration of President Woodruff on September 24, 1890, commonly called the Manifesto, which was issued by President Woodruff and adopted by the Church as its general practice, October 6, 1890, which forbade any marriages violative of the law of the land, I, Joseph F. Smith, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hereby affirm and declare that no such marriages have been solemnized with the sanction, consent, or knowledge of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I hereby announce that all such marriages are prohibited. And if any officer or member of the Church shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression against the Church and will be liable to be dealt with according to the rules and regulations thereof and excommunicated therefrom. Signed, President Joseph F. Smith." End quote. From 1890 to 1904, the Church leadership had been tacitly approving of or merely turning a blind eye to new plural marriages. With this Second Manifesto of 1904, plural marriages were officially prohibited, and the polygamy witch hunt from within the Church was officially kicked off. As stated in the LDS.org article, ending plural marriage was a process. It wasn't an on-off binary commandment. Many of those in plural relationships saw the 1890 and 1904 manifestos as merely a suspension of plural marriage in Utah. On the public face of the LDS Church, polygamy was officially unacceptable, but behind closed doors of the temple, some of the leadership saw it as necessary to continue practicing to fulfill this new and everlasting covenant as commanded by previous prophets. And now our focus begins to shift towards Short Creek. Short Creek is home to the twin cities of polygamy, namely Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. These were originally settled by Mormon polygamists back in 1860, and Brigham Young had said during a visit that one day Short Creek, quote, would be the head and not the tail of the church, end quote. Finally, in 1913, the area was founded as a ranching community, home to dozens of polygamist families. And now we introduce somebody into the fold who will become an early leader of the FLDS, Lauren C. Woolley. Woolley had served as a mail carrier among the Mormon leadership right before the 1890 Manifesto was released. Woolley had been interacting with John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff in their hideouts while they were hiding from the government due to their practicing of polygamy. Lauren Woolley claimed to have an 1886 revelation from John Taylor, which assumed the first-person God narrative when John Taylor supposedly asked God about polygamy. This is the text of that 1886 claimed revelation. Quote, "My son, John Taylor, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant, how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. And how can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I, the Lord, am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated, nor done away with, but they stand forever. Have I not given my word in great plainness on this subject? Yet have not great numbers of my people been negligent in observance of my law and the keeping of my commandments? And yet have I borne with them these many years? And this because of their wickedness, because of the perilous times. And furthermore, it is more pleasing to me that men should use their free agency in regard to these matters. Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And have I not commanded men that if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting, and those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Even so, amen. End quote. The details surrounding how this revelation came to be have evolved since Woolley claimed to have the text of the revelation in 1912. And it kind of gives the story a bit of a legendary status of being this 8-hour meeting during which the resurrected Joseph Smith appeared to John Taylor to deliver the revelation. Whether or not John Taylor actually gave this revelation has been called into question, as the document only surfaced more than 25 years after his death. Nobody could call it into question, as it was reportedly given in a closed-door meeting while Taylor was in hiding from the government. Nothing corroborates this document. Woolley just cropped up in 1912 with a piece of paper sporting John Taylor's signature, and the cornerstone for a new prophetic foundation for a breakoff sect was officially laid. Short Creek soon became a refugee camp for those who were excommunicated from the mainstream LDS church for practicing polygamy. Over the next 2 decades, up into the 1930s, the area would amass a significant population of polygamists, and the LDS Church seemed to try their best to ignore the existence of this community. The geographical location of Short Creek offered some insulation from raids by state officials. It's right on the border of Utah and Arizona in this little basin, so when state officials would raid the area, the inhabitants would merely move across a state line out of their jurisdiction. So during this 2-decade period from the early 1910s to the 1930s, a number of significant events occurred for polygamists in Mormonism. In 1918, President Joseph F. Smith passed away and handed his prophetic mantle down to Heber J. Grant, who went on a public crusade to end polygamy once and for all, or to disconnect the fundamentalist sects from the mainstream LDS Church. Eventually, these disparaged practitioners who were slowly divorcing themselves from the mainstream LDS Church formed what was known as the Council of Friends, in an effort to consolidate power and leadership over the numerous polygamous sects. Lauren Woolley claimed that John Taylor had originally formed the Council of Friends back in 1886, at the same time he had delivered the revelation that we previously read. The Council of Friends was supposedly comprised of George Q. Cannon, Samuel Bateman, Charles Wilkin, I believe it is, John Woolley, and Lauren Woolley. Lauren later claimed in 1932 that the Council of Friends dated back to Joseph Smith, who initially founded the council in 1832. These were all spurious claims, and not documentable. And we can't really minimize Woolley's self-interest in having divine sanction for his actions in order to continue practicing polygamy. I found this website, MormonFundamentalism.com, about the Council of Friends. I haven't found who is the writer of most of these articles and who runs the website, but from all I can tell, it seems like this is Brian Hale's, the believing LDS foremost historian and scholar on Mormon polygamy. It looks like it's kind of his brain dump website. So I'm going to be quoting extensively from MormonFundamentalism.com, and I recommend that you check out the show notes to find links to all of the articles that I'm using. This is from his article about the Council of Friends. Quote, "Throughout the 1920s, church leaders worked diligently to neutralize the efforts of the budding fundamentalists. President Heber J. Grant issued stern warnings denouncing their teachings and practices in 1925, 1926, and 1931. Finally, in June 1933, the first presidency, comprised of Heber J. Grant, Anthony W. Ivins, and J. Reuben Clark Jr., issued an official statement, which was published in the Deseret News Church section. Called by many the final manifesto, it was penned by Second Counselor Clark and warned that, quote, polygamous or plural marriages are not and cannot now be performed, and was written in order that there may be no excuse for any church member to be misled by the false representations or the corrupt, adulterous practices of the members of this sect, and by reputation, oath-bound organization, end quote. Back to the article. The declaration did more than simply clarify church doctrine and advise church members. It also assisted in transforming, quote, a ragtag collection of polygamous sympathizers into a cohesive movement. With Joseph Musser as typewriter, Woolley, Broadbent, and Barlow fired back by publishing one of the most revolutionary teachings to ever emerge from Mormon fundamentalism. End quote. We're not going to read that here, the final manifesto, or what Joseph Musser, Lauren Woolley, and J. Leslie Broadbent and John Barlow wrote here, but you can find a link to this whole thing in the show notes, and you'll find also a separate link for the 1933 final manifesto as it's known, but it is absolutely scathing. The final manifesto was the final straw for the Council of Friends under Lauren Woolley's direction, who supposedly took the mantle of senior member of the Council of Friends from his father, John Woolley, who had died back in 1928. This 1932 council was composed of Lauren Woolley, J. Leslie Broadbent, John Yates Barlow, which is an important individual we'll focus on, Joseph Musser, another really prominent person in all of the Mormon fundamentalists and the Council of Friends, as well as Charles Zitting, LeGrand Woolley, and Louis A. Kelch. I think Kelch. So Lauren Woolley, John Y. Barlow, and Joseph Musser. Those were the head honchos that we need to focus on. And they were, essentially, they led the Council of Friends, and they spearheaded the public opposition to the LDS Church with their abolition of polygamy. And at this time, Joseph Musser was a prolific writer, and in refutation of this 1933 final manifesto, he wrote a book titled The New and Everlasting Covenant of Marriage, to which the article referred previously. And that marked a prominent shift in the already strained relationship between the LDS Church and the fundamentalists down in Short Creek. From later on in that same article on MormonFundamentalism.com, quote, the first hints were provided in a new book entitled The New and Everlasting Covenant of Marriage, authored by Joseph Musser. Receiving the first editions months later in October, he promptly mailed a copy to each of the general authorities and placed some in bookstores. At that time, one devout polygamist, Charles Zitting, was praying about when the church shall be set in order, and a voice audibly told him, quote, that the forces are not strong enough, but when Brother Joseph's book comes out, the numbers will increase rapidly. Back to the article. Joseph Musser spent the next week distributing more copies of the New and Everlasting Covenant of Marriage, wherein he explained that, quote, there is a priesthood organization greater than that of the church, and that priesthood always has, can now, and will continue to function aside from and independent of the church. Back to the article. Joseph Musser's book provided the very first introduction to the idea that there is a priesthood organization above the church being God's power on the earth. End quote. The Council of Friends, as it was known and organized by Lauren Woolley, went by a number of names, but it's always been viewed by the adherents to these groups to be above any religion in priesthood authority, superseding the authority of the Quorum of the 12 and the LDS Church presidency. Most fundamentalist sects today still adhere to some version of a Council of Friends, with varying numbers from 1 to as many as 14 or more people. It's just worth noting that Woolley's original Council of Friends is where this authority was originally claimed, and he traced his lineage back to Joseph Smith founding it initially in 1832. But there's not really much documentation for that. Now, one person that we need to focus on, he's absolutely paramount to the foundation of the FLDS, is a guy just briefly mentioned before, and that's John Yates Barlow. MormonFundamentalism.com has a solid article on this guy, and it provides a nice summary of his early history and attitudes towards polygamy. Check the show notes for this link. Quote, John Yates Barlow was born 4th of March 1874, the son of Israel Barlow, an ardent supporter of plural marriage, both before and after the 1904 Second Manifesto. John Barlow took his first plural wife in 1902, one more in 1918 and another in 1923. He served as a missionary to the Northwestern States Mission, where Apostle Melvin J. Ballard presided, but secretly preached plural marriage to members and investigators. In 1935, Ballard recalled, quote, 17 years ago, I discovered John Y. Barlow was teaching polygamy out there among my missionaries. I asked him about it, and he defended the idea so vigorously that I said to him, if you're such a strong advocate of it, you must be practicing it. Barlow said, that's just what I've been doing. Back to Mormon fundamentalism. Dishonorably released and sent home early from his mission, Barlow was later excommunicated, with Elder Ballard serving as a witness against him. Nathaniel Baldwin met John in 1921, recording, quote, came home from a little ride up the canyon. Young John Barlow sat in the back seat of the machine car with his 2 wives. They seemed to be happy and contented. Young Barlow seemed to be also full of faith and hope, and seemed to be contented with his condition, being also cut off from the church, end quote. Now, of course, with any religious movement, infighting is expected and arguably necessary for the growth and expansion of the group. The senior member, Lauren Woolley, passed away in 1934, naming J. Leslie Broadbent as his rightful successor, who subsequently passed away in 1935, only a year later. The ensuing conflict created differing factions of fundamentalist sects. Back to MormonFundamentalism.com. Quote, at Broadbent's death, 2 men claimed to be his rightful successor. Charles Eldon Kingston, son of Charles W. Kingston, asserted that Leslie had designated him as the second elder. The Kingstons would eventually establish the Davis County Cooperative Society, remaining entirely separate from all other Mormon fundamentalist sects. John Y. Barlow, who sat next in line in seniority of the Council of Friends, also asserted his position as the senior member. Many also believed that Broadbent had designated him as second elder. Regardless, the majority of polygamists followed Barlow's leadership, believing him to be the presiding priesthood leader on earth. It was a calling that he readily accepted, end quote. John Yates Barlow now had his own faction of Mormon fundamentalism in the mid-1930s, which became the ruling body over the polygamists living in Short Creek. The LDS Church decided to capitalize on this momentary fracturing in September of 1935. They went with a nuclear option, to either bring the polygamists into line with the LDS Church leadership or to cut them off entirely. They sent President Claude Hershey, I believe is how you pronounce his name, to Short Creek with a powerful oath of fealty in hand. This is from Martha Bradley's Kidnapped from That Land, the Government Raids on the Short Creek Polygamists, taken from page 57. Quote, Stake President Claude Hershey presented to the members of the Short Creek branch a loyalty oath designed to test their allegiance to President Heber J. Grant and their conformity with the church's anti-polygamy stand. As reproduced in Truth magazine, it stated, quote, now quoting this oath of loyalty, quote, Short Creek, Arizona, September 7th, 1935. To the stake president and high councils of Zion Park Stake and to whom it may concern. I, the undersigned member of Short Creek branch of the Rockville Ward of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, declare and affirm that I, without any mental reservation whatsoever, support the presidency of the church, and that I repudiate any intimation that any of the presidency or apostles of the church are living a double life, and that I denounce the practice and advocacy of plural marriage as being out of harmony with the declared principle of the church at the time. Back to Martha Bradley, quote, Fundamentalists in the group, many of whom had entered into the principle, unanimously refused to sign the document. Then they waited, but not for long, partly because of their connections with the Barlow group. That same day, 7th September 1935, the Zion Park Stake Presidency and High Council moved to excommunicate 21 adult members of the Short Creek branch without a formal church court, close the branch altogether, and remove the Mormon Church from Short Creek, Arizona. They dispensed with the traditional methods of church adjudication, which would have allowed the defendants to present evidence and question the witnesses. End quote. And just like that, John Yates Barlow and his Council of Friends, in response to the LDS Church's nuclear option oath of fealty they presented, excommunicated the LDS Church from Short Creek and removed any members there who refused to adhere to the Council of Friends as their sole leadership body. Like some kind of morbid amputation of a diseased limb, this was cutting the final nerve connecting the two churches, creating co-evolving sects of Mormonism with wildly different goals in mind. The one to amass wealth and worldwide membership, the other to amass wives and celestial glory while insulating themselves from the rest of the outside world. One important issue raised in that 1935 Oath of Fealty, which we haven't really discussed, is the accusations flying around that the leadership of the LDS Church were living double lives. We have to remember, this Oath of Fealty was delivered in 1935, and plural marriages were solemnized underground in the LDS Church until, leading up to the early 1910s. There were still a few of the LDS elite living in the 1930s who had made the trek across the plains as children and lived their whole lives under the law of celestial plural marriage in Utah. There were still a number of practicing LDS who had been sealed to multiple wives prior to the 1904 Second Manifesto, and that was less than a generation before the uprising of the fundamentalist faction in Short Creek. There were LDS leaders at this time living a double life. Any accusation this Council of Friends was lobbing at the headquarters in Salt Lake City, those were founded in reality. And for legal and PR reasons, the LDS Church needed those accusations not to be true. They were still trying to erase their past with polygamy to be in line with the Constitution of Utah and the laws of the federal government. The division and strife between the LDS Church and the fundamentalists would become the primary PR nightmare for the LDS Church, while the fundamentalists were just trying to practice what Joseph had taught was the new and everlasting covenant in order to attain their celestial glory. As the churches evolved parallel to each other in different ways, the LDS Church fell further in line with mainstream Christianity, and the fundamental LDS became deeper entrenched in their beliefs and more isolated. The Utah and Arizona state governments would make laws known from time to time throughout a series of raids spanning the rest of the 20th century. The most well-known of these raids on the FLDS is just known ominously as the Short Creek Raid of 1953. This specific Short Creek Raid is truly a blight on American history. Governor Howard Pyle of Arizona had been dealing with the lawlessness of the FLDS, who weren't paying much of their taxes, and finally, Governor Pyle decided to take action. There were also abundant rumors of child brides being taken as polygamist wives well before reaching the age of 18, which really looks terrible for any governor if this is happening in their state without any action being taken to mitigate these rampant statutory violations. And one major issue to point out is that the FLDS was a group run by a few selected elites in the movement. Those elites owned most of the property, the majority of the wives, and they were also the most egregious violators of state and federal laws. And, well, they weren't paying their taxes very well. For this particular Short Creek raid, the Utah state government took a back seat and let Arizona take the lead. This single raid represents a confluence of completely differing worldviews coming into conflict with each other. From the FLDS perspective, try and picture it this way. I mean, put yourself in their shoes. We're just trying to practice our religion in a country which guarantees religious liberty and the free exercise thereof. We don't recognize the federal government as having any jurisdiction over the kingdom of God in Short Creek. We're living happy lives in line with what God wants, and we're endlessly persecuted by our government. But now try and put yourself in the government's shoes. We've been dealing with this religious cult for decades now, and they've eluded the constraints of law and paying all their taxes for far too long. These religious zealots are marrying children and sex trafficking them across state lines. Their standard of living is significantly lower than the rest of the country, and very few people there are educated in any secular schools. Property is divided up among the people as the church sees fit, but they've given all their property to the church, and none of their marriages are legally binding, so should a divorce happen, These poor women and children have no legal recourse or right to their own property. We have to do whatever possible to stop this cult from gaining any more followers. Back to the FLDS perspective, we have to do whatever necessary to follow the prophet and keep living God's words and will through the new and everlasting covenant. You see, these directly opposed viewpoints, they finally came to a head on the 26th of July, 1953. The day before this Short Creek raid happened, in order to keep the FLDS from being tipped off about the raid and just abandoning the settlement, the county deputies cut the single telephone line going into the community. And as dawn broke on the 26th of July, someone had tipped the Mormons off about the raid, and they just accepted their fate. They gathered the whole community in the schoolhouse, and they began singing hymns while they sent the little children out in the schoolyard to play. And the sun began to rise on the community. 102 armed and uniformed police officers and members of the Arizona National Guard flooded into the community, and they made the largest mass arrest in American history. Of the more than 400 inhabitants of the town, only 6 people weren't taken into custody. 263 children and over 120 adults were rounded up and thrown into prison buses. Governor Howard Pyle, who spearheaded this prosecution, tried to spin this as a battle against insurrection opposed to government control, and more than 100 independent newspaper reporters were present during the raid. The governor had invited them to be there during the raid. This produced multiple effects, mostly negative, against the governor and police officers who gave the children into the hands of already overwhelmed social workers. For the next 2 weeks, newspaper front pages across the country were filled with pictures of crying children being ripped from the hands of screaming mothers, with men being led away in handcuffs. Headlines read like the dawning of a war on American soil. Quote, "Police operations at Short Creek like military raid on enemy post." Here's another one for you. "State marshals its forces in effort to wipe out plural marriage practices of the United Effort cult." Here's another one. "Short Creek cult smashed by Pyle." And headlines like that go on and on and on. More than 90% of the adults charged prior to this 1953 raid were taken into custody, and a bitter legal battle ensued. At the same time, a PR nightmare gripped Governor Pyle and the states of Arizona and Utah. Here's a couple of extracts from the Arizona Republic, published on the 27th of July, 1953, a day after the raid happened. Quote, "Highly competent investigators have been unable to find a single instance in the last decade of a child's reaching the age of 15 without having been forced into a shameful mockery of a marriage. The state of Arizona is fulfilling today one of every state's deepest obligations, to protect and defend the helpless. The state is moving at once to seek through the courts the custody of these 263 children, all under the age of 18. They are the innocent chattels of a lawless commercial undertaking of wicked design and ruthlessly exercised power. This, in turn, is the cooperative enterprise of 5 or 6 coldly calculating men who direct all of the operations and reap all of the profits, and are the evil heart of the insurrection itself." Now we have Governor Pyle's official statement, and it reads as follows, quote, "Before dawn today, the state of Arizona began and has now substantially concluded a momentous police action against insurrection within its own borders. Arizona has mobilized and used its total police force to protect the lives and future of 263 children. They are the product and the victims of the foulest conspiracy you could possibly imagine. More than 100 peace officers moved into Short Creek in Mojave County at 4 o'clock this morning. They have arrested almost the entire population of a community dedicated to the production of white slaves, who are without hope of escaping this degrading slavery from the moment of their birth." End quote. I just recommend that you do a newspaper archive search with the keywords Short Creek for the year of 1953. So you can read some of these articles that I've filled my mind with. It really gives one a realistic sense for the public perception and the widespread outcry for legally orphaning 263 children through the avenue of what many considered government overreach and discrimination against a specific religion. But the LDS Church back in Salt Lake City was one of the very few media outlets which commended the actions of Governor Pyle, even in spite of the significant public outcry against what had happened. The LDS Church could not have been more pleased with this raid on their enemy cult. From the July 27, 1953 publication of the Deseret News, we find such gems as these. Quote, "Law-abiding citizens of Utah and Arizona owe a debt of gratitude to Arizona's Governor Howard Pyle and to his police officers who, Sunday, raided the polygamous settlement at Short Creek and rounded up its leaders for trial. The existence of this community on our borders has been an embarrassment to our people and a smudge on the reputations of our two great states. We hope Governor Pyle will make good his pledge to eradicate the illegal practices conducted there before they become a cancer of a sort that is beyond hope of human repair." That was actually quoting Governor Pyle specifically. Back to the Deseret News. "Any individuals who may once have been members of the LDS Church and who have engaged in practices which prompted the raid by the government of the state of Arizona have apostatized or have been excommunicated from the church. They are in no way connected with the church and are living in open defiance of its doctrines and the laws of the land. As one of its fundamental tenets, the church teaches that its members believe in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law." That's, of course, the LDS Church's tenets. Now it's going back to a different part in the same article. "Again, we commend the governor for his forthright efforts. We have full confidence that the rights of the innocent will be protected. The accused will be given a fair trial, and we hope the unfortunate activities at Short Creek will be cleaned up once and for all." End quote. There's so much to parse out of that editorial from the LDS-owned Deseret News. First off, the LDS Church called the fundamentalists, the FLDS, an embarrassment to Utah and Arizona. And I'd be willing to bet that the FLDS saw the LDS Church in the same light and wished the same fate to befall them. But the LDS Church wasn't committing infractions against the law as flagrantly as the FLDS, so the LDS Church wasn't really in danger of something like this happening. Second, to pull out of this article, the LDS Church clearly wanted the FLDS eradicated, in line with what Governor Pyle had said about them becoming a cancer beyond hope of repair. And to think that the LDS Church had no dog in this fight would be hilariously ignorant. If their nearest geographical competitor for prophetic claim was to be taken out by the government, that removes the FLDS from common parlance of religious sectarianism, and it leaves many people believing in the Book of Mormon to be soaked up by the ever-hungry LDS Church. The ideological divides between these two churches seems to fall away when there are unattended sheep to be absorbed by the shepherd with an already larger flock. Now, third to take away from this article, the Deseret News article never said anything about polygamy. They beat around the bush about it. They said individuals who engaged in practices which prompted the raid. They never hit the nail on the head in saying that those people who practice polygamy are in apostasy. It says, quote, "They are in no way connected with the church and are living in open defiance of its doctrines." End quote. This is the active distancing that the LDS Church was trying to do. They were trying not to take any of the splash damage from this explosion in the media. The FLDS and its adherents had been excommunicated from the LDS Church back in 1935, but this Deseret News article failed to mention that the FLDS had also excommunicated the LDS Church from their ranks at that same time. Whoever delivers the wrath of God holds the real authority, right? So I can understand the LDS Church casting condemnation from their superior legal position. But that last part, where the church said that the FLDS is living in open defiance to church doctrine. That's simply not true. The LDS Church is the one living in open defiance to their own doctrine. Doctrine and Covenants section 132 still sits in part of the Mormon canon, and it's very explicit that polygyny is necessary to get to the highest degree of the celestial kingdom. The LDS Church completely ignores this, or it doesn't actively practice it so that they can remain in peaceful harmony with the government. But you can be certain that half a century before this raid happened, the LDS Church was openly practicing polygamy, which is exactly what Joseph had commanded them to do as doctrine of the Mormon religion. And I would further postulate that if polygamy is decriminalized in the near future, that the LDS Church will be happy to jump right back onto that D&C 132 bandwagon. None of the manifestos retracted the doctrine. They just suspend it until U.S. law falls into line with their own doctrine. Here's a quick thought exercise for you. Let's just say that polygamy is decriminalized next week. With a magic wave of the legal wand and no lobbying from any church one way or another, let's just make it legal for this hypothetical. How would that change the church's missionary efforts in other countries where polygamy is still illegal? Would they encourage people to move to the United States to be able to legally practice the new and everlasting covenant and ensure their passage into the celestial kingdom? Would they encourage people to practice it in private like they did before the Second Manifesto in spite of what the government says, just like, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor, and Wilford Woodruff did? Or would the church decry polygamy as being counter to God's will in spite of what their canon says in Doctrine and Covenants 132? This might just be a conversation or a hypothetical that we'll have to revisit in the future or something, but, feel free to weigh in on Facebook and Twitter at Naked Mormonism. I personally have no idea what's most plausible. How would the church react if, suddenly polygamy were legal and they could practice their new and everlasting covenant? How would the FLDS react to this? I don't know. It's a confusing kind of thing to try and wrap our minds around. So finally, the fourth thing to parse out of that Deseret News article, the LDS Church hoped that Governor Pyle would clean up the FLDS once and for all. What does that look like? What does that mean? What was the LDS Church hoping for? Did they want the FLDS to be legally disbanded as a church? Did they want all the leadership locked up for life? I mean, what does that exactly look like? So once again, this is just an example of the LDS Church lobbing media bombs at a smaller cousin religion from their higher status as publicly acceptable. If we can learn anything from the history of the LDS Church in Utah, it's that it takes a really heavy dose of persecution all at one time to actually snuff out a religion. Even if one little tiny sprout remains alive, that religion will continue to flourish, and the persecution will only fertilize the religious soil and galvanize the followers to more viciously oppose whatever force is persecuting them, whether that's the government or the broader LDS Church. The public was so appalled by the Governor Pyle's iron-fisted approach to dealing with the FLDS, and all of these pictures of children being ripped from the arms of their crying mothers, and, who were being placed in handcuffs, all of that came back to haunt Governor Pyle during his 1954 re-election campaign, and he lost his seat in almost a landslide loss to Democratic underdog Ernest McFarland. Pyle blamed the 1953 FLDS raid the previous year for his loss to that next governor's seat. But persecution or prosecution, depending on which side of the belief spectrum you find yourself on, against the FLDS Church and its leadership continued. By 1954, there were three main factions of polygamist sects, overlooking a significant amount of confusion about the proper leader and who was legitimately ordained to be the leader. Eldon Kingston had broken off from the leadership vacuum left behind by J. Leslie Broadbent's death back in the late 1930s, and he formed what was known as the Kingston Group, or the Latter-day Church of Christ. John Yates Barlow had called Leroy Johnson and Rulon Jeffs to be members of his Council of Friends, and John Barlow was the primary leader until his death in 1949. The 1953 raid on Short Creek upset a lot of people and incarcerated most of the leadership of the FLDS apart from the Kingston group, which actually didn't suffer anything during this raid as they are located further north in Utah. Rulon Allred had been affiliated with the writer Joseph Musser, who released that Paramount book in the 1930s. He had been affiliated with Joseph Musser since 1935. And Joseph Musser was the sacred glue which held the fundamentalists' leadership together. He passed away in 1954, a year after this infamous Short Creek raid, and the ensuing chaos from Joseph Musser's death and the raid fractured the fundamentalist groups once again. Rulon Allred claimed to be the rightful successor, and he formed the Apostolic United Brethren, or the AUB, colloquially referred to, with their own priesthood council of friends. And then Leroy Johnson took leadership of the original FLDS faction that was formed in Short Creek at the same time. John Barlow had also called Rulon Jeffs into his FLDS Council of Friends priesthood leadership group. Leroy Johnson took leadership of the FLDS Church during the confusion following Musser's death in 1954, and he led the FLDS until 1986. So before we get into the more modern history of the FLDS and everything post 1986, we need to briefly introduce one of the primary confounding factors to all of these groups, and that was land and property ownership. These fundamentalist groups practiced the fundamental tenet of Mormonism known as the New and Everlasting Covenant. That's a euphemism for polygamy. But they also attempted in some instances to practice the United Order, another fundamental doctrine introduced by Joseph Smith in 1834 of communalistic approaches to ownership of property. Around 1925, 2 decades prior to Joseph Musser's death and most of these prominent breaking up splits happened, the polygamist sects created the United Effort Plan. This United Effort Plan, the UEP as it's referred to, was the dedicated trust for members' property to be deeded over to, which was controlled by the Council of Friends. So basically, if you were a Mormon fundamentalist and you owned property, the Council of Friends required that you give that property to the church, and they divvied that property out as they saw fit. This was a fundamental tenet that Joseph Smith taught. He called it the United Order. Some versions of the UEP, United Effort Plan, survive in most of the fundamentalist sects today, as it was taught as a fundamental tenet by Joseph Smith. These common property trusts do nothing but cause confusion and concentrate the entire community's wealth into the hands of the elites of that given group. Anytime the state or federal government has tried to step in to curtail the control of these groups or enforce law on the leadership of these groups, these trusts have usually been a central issue to draw the attention of the government and cause chaos and confusion. When it comes to paying taxes, the trusts only create more problems because the average follower doesn't have much, if any, property legally in their name, but they live in housing and drive vehicles which require tax to be collected on, which they usually pay into the trust with the assumption that the trust is turning around and paying taxes on the property that they're using. Often, that second step doesn't happen. So the people living in the houses pay their taxes, but the United Effort Plans don't pay the government taxes. They just collect that money. So that means that the people living in these houses are foreclosed on and removed from their homes because the leadership isn't paying those people's taxes. So all of that said, it's the average follower who suffers the wrath of the government for not paying their taxes. It's not necessarily the leadership. These communalist trusts are something to keep in mind throughout the entirety of understanding the legal issues with the fundamentalist groups. Most of them share a United Effort Plan or some iteration of it in common, and it only causes headaches for everyone. So to zoom back into our timeline, upon Leroy Johnson's death in 1986, Rulon Jeffs became the leader of the FLDS, and he instated Winston Blackmore as the sole trustee over the polygamous sects in British Columbia, in the Bountiful area of British Columbia, as long as Blackmore kept in line with the FLDS and he looked to the Jeffs family as the sole religious leaders. One quick addition I got to throw in here before getting into Warren Jeffs. The 1953 raid was the most prominent and publicly circulated PR nightmare of all of the raids on the fundamentalist groups. It wasn't the only raid, though. As early as the 1940s, the government had been mounting small raids on various groups, including those in Short Creek, but 1953 was the largest, and it cut the deepest scars into the collective psyche of the groups. There were subsequent smaller raids in the 1980s, which were largely unsuccessful in curtailing any abuse. But those smaller raids did reopen those scars from the big 1953 raid. One quick diversion, the FLDS has been our primary focus here. We've only mentioned other groups in the periphery so far, but that's what happens when you try and cover 100 years of history in just over an hour. So here's a brief list of other polygamist and fundamentalist groups, which all came from Mormonism, which had brief lives or, some of them even exist to this day. One of the largest we mentioned before is the Kingston group, and that was founded by Charles and Eldon Kingston. Today, that's led by Eldon Kingston's son, Paul Eldon Kingston, who's been the leader since 1987. Then there's the Apostolic United Brethren, also known as the Allred group. That was founded when Rulon Allred was refused admission into the Council of Friends in the late 1940s. Today, it's led by a man named Lynn A. Thompson, who took the mantle of leadership in 2014 from a J. Lemoyne Jensen, who had been leading it since 2005. Now, J. Lemoyne Jensen was the first non-Allred leader of the group who took the mantle from Rulon Allred's son, Owen, who had been leader of the Apostolic United Brethren since 1977. Another one of these groups is known as the Centennial Park Group, and that was founded by J. Marion Hammond in 1983 after Leroy Johnson dismissed them from the Short Creek FLDS. They're also known as the Second Ward, and they consider the FLDS in Short Creek to be the First Ward, so they're a little bit tighter affiliated with the FLDS than most of the other groups. There's also one major tangent that we haven't really brought up, and that's the LeBaron group. And that was founded by Alma Dayer LeBaron Sr. as a separate stake from Joseph Musser's Council of Friends group, all the way back in 1936. LeBaron's sons were excommunicated from the LDS Church for teaching plural marriage in 1944, after which they closely affiliated with Rulon Allred's Apostolic United Brethren. In 1955, Joel LeBaron organized the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times in Salt Lake City, and from then on they've been known as the LeBaron Group. There's also the Church of Jesus Christ in Solemn Assembly. That's another Utah-based fundamentalist group. It was founded in 1977 by a man named Alex Joseph, but after his death in 1998, the group seems to have dissolved or been driven underground. It's kind of unclear. Another group, another fundamentalist group, is known as the Church of the Firstborn and the General Assembly of Heaven. And that's actually a fairly recent group, and that was founded in Magna, Utah in 2001, all the way up into the 21st century. That was led by a man named Terrell R. Dalton, who runs this sect to this day. There are dozens of other groups, and I've probably missed a number of really prominent ones, but the main takeaway that I offer with this list is that Mormon fundamentalism is like green jello. You can try and squash it, you can try and mold its form, you can hit it with a hammer. No matter what you try to do, Mormon fundamentalism and polygamy only spreads and separates into smaller factions, making them increasingly harder to track and police for any abuses. Sexual abuse, child labor abuse, tax abuses, any kind of abuse or any illegal infractions they commit. So let's go ahead and broach one of the central focuses for today's episode to finish this out. Warren Jeffs is a challenging icon of Mormon fundamentalism to wrap one's mind around. Today's examination of Warren Jeffs only hits on a few high points to understand some of the most prominent features of his history and career. And I've gained some personal opinions of Warren Jeffs, which I'll briefly share once we know a bit more about the man. but I would encourage you all to look him up with the resources provided in the show notes to gain your own nuanced understanding of who Warren Jeffs really is. Hopefully the information I present will offer you a basis for why I have my specific opinions about Warren Jeffs. Let's start at the beginning. Warren C. Jeffs was born 4th December 1955 to Rulon Jeffs and Marilyn Steed. He was called as a counselor to his father, Rulon, upon reaching marriageable age and leadership age, of course. In 2002, Rulon Jeffs died at the age of 92, and Warren became the new FLDS prophet, leader, spiritual guide, whatever you want to call him. However conservative Rulon Jeffs was in keeping the FLDS group isolated from the Gentile world outside, Warren cranked everything up another few notches. A few powerful reforms came into place when Warren Jeffs took the mantle. He called for all members to wear clothes only made by themselves, no outside books, no Gentile music, no internet, and he effectively cut off all communication with the outside world. He also commanded all the members to pull their children from the public education system in lieu of homeschooling, an order to which they promptly complied. Warren also excommunicated Winston Blackmore as head trustee of the British Columbia sect of the FLDS, and he absorbed all of Blackmore's wives and children into his harem and brought the Canadian polygamists deeper under FLDS control. The rise of Warren Jeffs coincided with Utah Attorney General Mark Shurtleff's crackdown on polygamy. In October 2003, Mark Shurtleff passed polygamy reform throughout Utah courts, which further criminalized polygamy with steeper sentences, and he announced a sweeping investigation of the Hilldale police force, recommending decertification of any police officers with more than one wife, because obviously they were compromised. 2003 was a hard year for Warren Jeffs, but it was nothing compared to 2004. In mid-2004, a nephew of Jeffs, named Brent Jeffs, filed a lawsuit against Warren, alleging sexual abuse as a child perpetrated by Warren. Also in 2004, Warren Jeffs cleansed the leadership and made himself the sole sealing authority in the group, so all marriages would require approval of Jeffs and nobody else. At the same time, he excommunicated 21 men from Short Creek, prominently leaders in the FLDS cult, including the mayor of the town, and he reassigned their wives and children to other men, taking many of them for himself. He also absorbed all of their personal property into the FLDS United Effort Plan and required them to be physically removed from the community. By the end of 2004, Warren Jeffs was beginning to hear rumors of an impending arrest and began spending much of his time in hiding. 2005 got much harder for Warren Jeffs. And there's truly no way I can convey to you just how large of a criminal empire Jeffs was amidst constructing at this time. In June 2005, Jeffs was charged with sexual assault on a minor, with an added conspiracy to commit sexual misconduct for arranging underage marriages. He was formally indicted on sexual assault charges in July 2005 while on the lam. Utah's Attorney General, Mark Shurtleff, ordered the freezing of the United Effort Plan's assets, which amounted to more than $100 million at this time. That's how much wealth Warren Jeffs' criminal empire had amassed by 2005. At this time, Jeffs and the FLDS elite were dealing mainly in cash, and they were often carrying around in excess of $100,000 on their person. Warren Jeffs' brother, named Seth, was arrested under suspicion of harboring his brother as a fugitive of the law during a routine traffic stop. And Seth Jeffs was found with nearly $142,000 in cash and about $7,000 worth of prepaid debit cards. The state of Arizona placed a $10,000 bounty on Warren's head at this time. The state of Utah also charged him with fleeing prosecution for evading court indictments and staying in hiding. And then in early April 2006, things only became worse. The state of Utah issued a warrant for Jeffs' arrest on felony charges of accomplice statutory rape of a teenage girl, and the following month the FBI placed Jeffs on their top 10 most wanted fugitives list and raised the bounty to $100,000. It was expected that he was traveling at any given time with faithful armed guards to ensure safe travels, and warnings related to that were issued by the state. In June of 2006, Warren Jeffs returned to Colorado City, Arizona to perform marriage ceremonies, as he was the only man with sealing authority. It's understood at this time that Jeffs had taken more than 70 wives. An anonymous website posted recent pictures of him celebrating with new child brides as young as 12 years old in Short Creek, and authorities instantly knew that he was in only a few possible areas and they were on heightened alert. And finally, on the 28th of August 2006, in true crime lord fashion, Warren Jeffs was pulled over in his iconic brand new red Cadillac Escalade in a routine traffic stop for not displaying his temporary plates. You can find an article in the show notes that covers the entire arrest and has a bunch of pictures of everything that happened at this time. He was found arrested with one of his wives and his brother, and they had in the car 4 laptops, 16 burner cell phones, multiple disguises, and more than $55,000 in cash. Following his arrest, Warren Jeffs faced 2 counts of felony accomplice to rape charges in Utah. After conviction of those charges, Arizona was next to charge him on 2 different accomplice to rape accounts and 8 other counts including sexual assault on a minor and incest. His Utah conviction was reversed, and he was transported to Arizona for trial. The Arizona state prosecutors claimed it would be impractical and unnecessary to try Jeffs in Arizona as the witnesses no longer wanted to testify against him, and he had spent 2 years in prison already. Finally, on August 9th, 2011, Warren Jeffs was convicted on 2 counts of sexual assault of a child and sentenced to life plus 20 and a $10,000 fine by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He becomes eligible for parole in 2038. If he survives that long, he'll be the age of 83 years old. Viewing Warren Jeffs' colorful career as prophet the way that we just now did in a few minutes is like staring at a vast mountain range from our own historical peak and only paying attention to the few peaks that rise above the misty fjord, while ignoring all of the smaller peaks and valleys that add depth and character to his life. We could, and maybe we will, spend hours of this podcast talking about just Warren Jeffs. And, maybe one day our historical timeline will get there, but don't hold your breath. It's a few years in the future. Let me offer a few closing points of Jeffs' doctrine and teachings left behind as his true legacy before offering my own thoughts. Jeffs had and still has complete dictatorial control over his adherents. He controls what they wear, who they associate with, what media they talk to, who they're allowed to marry, and all information going in and out of the FLDS communes. He forces men and women to dress simply in clothes that they make for themselves, which look exactly like you'd expect. He forces men and women to marry each other, who otherwise may not come to fall in love through regular courtship. He doesn't allow any piercings or tattoos or distinguishing characteristics. None of those are allowed. He requires all members to be homeschooled, and the children are dramatically lacking in fundamental learning compared to their secular counterparts. All property, even to this day, is consecrated to the church's United Effort Plan, which all funnels up to the elite and eventually to Jeff's own pockets. The United Effort Plan has since been taken over by a non-FLDS trustee who deals with the tangled mess that Jeffs has spun for his adherents, which only further fuels this persecution narrative. Jeffs also encourages the FLDS members to take advantage of government welfare programs like the General Welfare Fund, food stamps, and the Women, Infant, and Children program. This takes money from the government and further funnels it straight to Jeffs and his wealthy elite, while the majority of FLDS families consistently struggle to put food on their tables. And now we get to some of the more salacious aspects of his legacy. With a roughly 50-50 split in population, there's always a dramatic shortage of women who are given over to the elites. That creates colonies of what are known as the Lost Boys. Those are faithful FLDS young men excommunicated just for simple lack of female resources. There just aren't enough women to go around, which also forces the elite to resort to child brides and incest. Jeffs also taught of blood atonement. If any Gentile or apostate commits certain sins, they can only pay for it through the shedding of their blood. Simply apostatizing from the FLDS can incur the wrath of blood atonement. The United Effort Plan owns a few manufacturing plants in or near Short Creek, and that's pretty much the only boon to their economy that they can get from outside sources. And much of the work is done by child labor, and the people are either paid in such a pathetic little pittance of a wage so as to be considered offensive by any objective observer, or they simply aren't paid at all, making it very challenging to distinguish from child slave labor. Another impact of polygamy and constant incest is birth defects. The Colorado City and Hilldale area, that's all of Short Creek, has the world's highest incidence of, I believe it's called fumarase deficiency, which is an extremely rare genetic condition. And that is just due to inbreeding and cousin marriage. This genetic condition can cause encephalopathy, severe intellectual disability, and unusual facial features, brain malformation, and epileptic seizures. So there are bred into the FLDS community genetic diseases because of their constant incest. Another thing to add into this mix, before Jeffs was arrested, in 2005, the Southern Poverty Law Center added the FLDS to its list of hate groups, and Jeffs is a notoriously bigoted man. Here are some quotes attributed to him that the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC, used in order to put the FLDS on their list. From Warren Jeffs' own teachings on race, quote, "The black race is the people through which the devil has always been able to bring evil unto the earth." End quote. Quote, "Cain was cursed with a black skin, and he is the father of the Negro people. He has great power, can appear and disappear. He is used by the devil as a mortal man to do great evils." End quote. Quote, "If you marry a person who has connections with a Negro, you would become cursed." End quote. On homosexuality, quote, "The people grew so evil. The men started to marry the men, and the women married the women. This is the worst evil act you can do next to murder. It is like murder. Whenever people commit that sin, then the Lord destroys them." End quote. And his opinions of the role of women, quote, "I have been instructed that any young man who will not leave our girls alone is to be sent away and not allowed to be among us, even before they destroy the girl." End quote. Destroy her by taking her virginity before one of the FLDS elites can have her. Given everything we've discussed today, I want to share a few parting thoughts. Warren Jeffs is given the label of that one crazy fundamentalist polygamist FLDS guy who's serving life in prison. He's a religious zealot who uses his religion to practice polygamy. One striking thing about learning so much of polygamy history for the past little while is a recurring thought which I can't seem to shake. Keeping polygamy outlaw as it currently stands is simply impractical, and it causes too much damage. We shouldn't condemn or convict Jeffs based on polygamy. He lied. He stole millions of dollars from over 10,000 people. He committed widespread fraud in multiple states. He raped. He tortured men and women, boys and girls. He brainwashed people. And he did unthinkable things we'll never have provable documentation of. Warren Jeffs did plenty of terrible things while prophet of the FLDS, and we can condemn him for everything else, even without factoring polygamy into the equation. There were two subsequent raids on the FLDS Short Creek area. One was in 2008, the other in 2010. In the 2008 raid, reminiscent of the 1953 raid, 439 children were taken into the custody of Child Protective Services of Texas. The 2010 raid turned up in very few arrests and no prosecutions. But let's hone in on Jeffs alone and ignore his equally dastardly elites. The truth of the matter is, Utah and Arizona both had a very hard time convicting Warren Jeffs, and both states ended up throwing out the cases. It was Texas which passed down the 2 rape charges judgment, landing him life in prison. Why? This man has more than 70 documentable wives, and there's absolutely no way of knowing that 70 number is actually accurate. And you mean to tell me that every single other one of those marriages are with informed consenting adults? 2 rape charges. 2. That's it? When he'd been raping children and teenagers for half a decade, while at the same time stealing their property and brainwashing these people? The state prosecutors of Utah and Arizona botched the Jeffs conviction. The prosecuting attorneys, Attorney General Mark Shurtleff, and everybody else involved in the case handled Jeffs with kid gloves, and now he's spending his time locked in a cage away from society, where he belongs. But he still provides divine directives to his followers from prison. Yeah, the FLDS, it's not done. They still have property all over the United States. The residents of Short Creek expect him to be miraculously released from prison and Jesus to all return in one fell swoop. The most faithful have moved to a compound in South Dakota where they are even more isolated from the outside world than they ever were in Short Creek, and they don't even allow outsiders into the South Dakota commune. The fundamental Latter-day Saints Hydra has only grown more heads with the removal of Jeffs, and the persecution narrative only further galvanizes and entrenches the average believer, which feeds into this perpetual isolation. In my opinion, Warren Jeffs is a deplorable human being, with no regard for how his actions damage the lives of his thousands of followers. He is utterly reprehensible. In a world with increasingly fewer heroes, he is a black-blooded villain responsible for ruining the lives and stealing the property of every FLDS follower. Why do they follow him? Because he's their prophet. Why did the government go so easy on an obvious crime lord? Same answer, because he's a prophet. Warren Jeffs is a man claiming to speak to and for God through divine revelation, living communalism, fervently believing in the religious teachings of the Bible, Book of Mormon, and Doctrine and Covenants. He wrote his own religious books that his followers eagerly devour when they can barely afford to feed their families. He's been chased from town to town while hiding from the law for committing atrocities, and he spun it all into the religious persecution narrative. He's built a temple to perform sealing practices in Texas. He claims to be the one person on earth who is truly led by God, while all other religions are false and led by corruption. The truth of the matter is, Warren Jeffs forces Mormonism to stare itself right in the mirror. I dare you to find a better analog to Joseph Smith in all of human history. And personally, I condemn Warren Jeffs for everything he did, especially for raping children. But the facts are that he got a Mormon religious exemption in the courts. If you put his rap sheet on a man named Jose Alvarez or Tony Delamoni or Muhammad Khabir or something, you have completely different conviction in the courts. But because Jeffs is a Mormon and he committed his atrocities in an area where the government and prosecution are largely Mormon, you can only stick him with 2 accomplice to rape charges and a fine for $10,000? I'm sorry, what? What about everything else? The hardest part about all of this is that he's the public face of polygamy in America. But Jeffs does not define polygamy. He is a malicious, child-raping predator. It's pretty simple to condemn Jeffs and not condemn polygamy at the same time. Jeffs is defined by his polygamy, or at least he's labeled as barely more than such. But what about all the truly heinous and misanthropic deeds he actually committed, deserving of truly terrible labels? How about fraud? What about con man, sexual assaulter, thief, predator? Warren Jeffs is a degraded, deceitful, pathetic parasite of a human being who relies on fear, intimidation, and calls for the apocalypse or untestable claims of divinity in order to achieve his ends. He's not creative. He's never done anything an objective observer would consider a commendable act of altruism. He's done nothing but lie, cheat, steal, and rape. But at least he was convicted for 2 of the rape charges, and he has to pay $10,000 in fines for everything he did, ignoring the over $100 million that he stole from tens of thousands of people. How is that fair? Only religion would allow him the loophole that he squeaked through, while the states largely ignored the system which empowered him to do what he did. So the 2008 raid rescued over 400 children from the cult, and yay, we cut off one head of the FLDS leadership. Big win, right? What about the other 6,000 people who currently live under his foot and still look towards his prison cell to get their divine directives from on high? I don't fault any single person for allowing a man like Warren Jeffs to rise. I fault the ideology and dogma which fostered the reality that made his rise and crime spree possible. And it's the same ideology and dogma which protected him from a harsher sentence once he was in cuffs. Religion. Here's a story that just broke last night on KUTV.com. Quote, 6 Mormon families suing LDS Church over alleged cover-up of child sex abuse. From the article. The 6 families allege LDS leaders knew one of their members was abusing children and actively covered up the abuse that continued for years. The case is scheduled to go to trial in January. Helen is one of the plaintiffs and spoke to KUTV's sister station in Washington, D.C., asking that only her first name be used, and said she reported the abuse of her 4 to 6-year-old children to her bishop, the leader of her Martinsburg, West Virginia congregation, and the top women's leader called the Relief Society president, who was also the abuser's mother. She said they didn't believe her and they didn't do anything. End quote. This is what the brief of the lawsuit states. Quote, the LDS Church knew it had a sex offender in its midst as early as December 2004 to January 2005, when Michael Jensen was charged in Provo, Utah with felony sexual abuse of 2 girls who pled guilty to 2 sex offenses in the presence of his parents, who became church leaders, and a church bishop in Provo. Now continuing with the article. It says that instead of warning others about Jensen, even as his predations began to mount, local church leaders covered up, minimized, and denied his abuse and dangerous proclivities, sponsored false explanations when the evidence of abuse surfaced, and touted him as a trustworthy and exceptional member of the church community. End quote. And these stories are a dime a dozen. Religion is the last bastion protecting bigotry and child molesters, and the most egregious examples become a Warren Jeffs, who never properly pays society back for all of the damage they've inflicted. At some point, we have to ask ourselves, if the best religion has to offer us is a sense of community we can get through other means, but everything we've discussed today is some of the worst things that religion can create, is that trade-off worth it? We shouldn't be so naive to paint all of polygamy with this same brush. This is patriarchal, religious polygamy. As soon as you taint real polygamy with religion, it becomes a system designed to oppress women and trade them as property, and the wealthiest get the most property. Some of my best friends are polyamorous, and they lead incredibly happy and healthy lives. They're very well educated, and they're really good parents because their relationships fill the 3 criteria of informed, consenting adults. None of those 3 boxes are checked when it comes to somebody like Warren Jeffs. The religious community may not want to see an example like Jeffs and consider themselves on the same spectrum as he, but all of them are. And the only way to show people just how twisted and disgusting some religion can be is by pointing out the similar faults in all religion. Shine the spotlight on religion's faults. Don't criminalize polygamy because happy people engage in secular poly relationships every day, and keeping it criminalized only fuels the persecution complex and force religious cults into compounds so they can effectively separate their sheep from the rest of the enlightened society. Shame on the government for letting Jeffs and his elite get away with so much and face such little penalties for what they did. Shame on religion for creating a world where the things that Jeffs did are somehow excusable. And shame on humanity for not taking a tougher stand against a truly evil human being. And to think that Jeffs somehow didn't know what he was doing, or to claim that he sincerely believes himself to be a prophet of God, carves out some kind of weird exemption for psychopathic and sociopathic behavior. If you have any reservations about his sincerely held religious beliefs and his religious freedom, I'll leave you with some audio posted by my friend Jonathan Streeter, Thinker of Thoughts, on his YouTube channel. It's a video released by the Washington, Utah County Attorney General's Office of an interaction between Warren and his brother Nephi in 2007. That will close out the episode for today. The next few episodes that I planned will be interviews that I've amassed during my time researching the subject of Mormon polygamy. We're going to jump into the historical timeline in the new year. Thank you so much to everybody for listening. Thank you so much to Julie for helping out with the Twitter and Facebook pages and all social media. Thank you to Jason Camo for providing music used in this show. Go to aloststateofmind.com. Thank you to Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres and Opening Arguments podcast for providing legal counsel in this show. Thank you so much to the supporters on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And thank you most of all to all of the listeners for listening to my angry screed about righteous and unrighteous polygamy. With that, I will leave you to the bone-chilling voice of Warren Jeffs talking to his brother Nephi Jeffs through a plexiglass window. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next time, here on the Naked Mormonism podcast.
To Nephi, you can tell anybody who wants to read this message or see the video that they can see it. Even apostates and Gentiles. That they may know that I have been a liar. And the truth is not in me. I am not the prophet. I never was the prophet.
You are the prophet.
Just a minute. The Lord's still dictating. This is not a test. This is a revelation from the Lord God of heaven. Through his former servant, who was never his servant, who is dictating these words at this time. That you may know this is not a test. I say farewell again to all who qualify for Zion. Farewell.
I love you. We love you. We love you.
preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.